So, lockdown sucks, yes. But that also means that you get to enjoy a new episode sooner than I planned. And that's not necessarily bad, right? So, what I've done today is a little bit special. I worked on some impressions and adapted our melody to some very specific examples, which I think you will probably recognize. And if you're new to this, just don't click away just yet, because you can start watching the series from any episode you want. I'm not following any order. So I will be using the very same melody that we had from the start, and here it goes. Cool, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. I know absolutely nothing about synths, and I don't pretend to do so. And to recreate these kind of sounds, I've used some presets from Massive and just, tweak the parameters a little bit. And we start with this glitchy kind of texture and this speeding up arpeggio with some delay effect on it, just to give it this kind of randomness. We have two arpeggiators playing this F major 7 arpeggio 2 octaves apart, and they are both phasing in and out of each other. In terms of melody and harmony, I've basically taken out some of the notes that we had in the original just to make it sound more like the original version in Stranger Things. In the low end, we have this kind of kick drum that sounds a little bit like a heartbeat, and some bass synths. We have a warm pad. And finally, to make it sound a little bit more retro, I've used this free plugin. It's called Isotope Vinyl, just to give it more of a lo-fi kind of feel. Let's play everything together. Okay, next. There's a lot going on in the low end for this one, and we have some kind of ostinato happening in low woodwinds and a trill on violas. We have a pedal tone on the rest of the strings, timpani and piano, but also some fast moving arpeggios on harp. Regarding the melody, I got quite lucky because I managed to make it sound quite similar to the original just by moving a couple of octaves around and making it slower. And for that, we have essentially French horns and trumpets playing some cluster chords phasing in and out of each other, with the top line doubled on flutes, glock, and bells. In the second half, we have a different kind of ostinato happening. For that, we have cellos on top of low woodwinds, violins, and oboes. The melody is again taken by French horns with the chords on trombones and trumpets terminating on a very dissonant sounding polychord. And as usual, we have percussion for accenting and swelling and all that good stuff. Let's take it from the top. We have a huge percussion groove on orchestral toms, but also timpani and tambourine. I know I'm gonna get a lot of questions in terms of libraries and stuff like that, so I can already tell you that toms are from the Spitfire original collection. I think it's called Cinematic Percussion or something. We have spiccatos and violins, doubled by clarinets and oboes an octave higher, but also harp and celeste. And just to make it a little bit more interesting, in the top end, we have some accents on glockenspiel and flutes. French horns and violas are playing some suspended chords. We have some power chords on low brass, strings and electric guitars, but on the second half they switch to open chords. By the way, if you're interested in the scores and the files for this session, it's available on my Patreon page. You can check the link in the cards or in the description below. But getting back to our example, we have the melody on French horns and violas, harmonized by violins, and then near the end is reversed on the other way around. And in the gaps, we have some woodwind phrases and runs and stuff like that. Cool, let's listen to everything together. Number 54. So we start with a run. For the harmony, I'm using just some suspended chords resolving on a C major 9 at the end. The melody is probably the most different from the first version of the theme, and I'm only using elements of it. And the reason is simply because I had to match the style of, the example I was referencing. And on this, we have a very thick kind of texture. We have violins and cellos, but also oboes and bassoons playing 3 octaves apart. Glock is playing accents, as usual. For the accompaniment, we have violas, trills, and this kind of rhythm on French horns. We have a trumpet line, harmonized in triads and doubled by Celeste, and this line is also setting up a modulation to a different key. At this point, we have a thicker accompaniment with cellos and bass pits, but also clarinets playing the very same rhythm but legato. And finally, you can hear some flute counterphrases just to add a little bit extra, Williams magic. $55. The coolest part about this is probably these minimalistic textures that we have on 3 pianos, but also marimba and celeste. And if you are familiar with the original score and the movie, I think Desplat used quantization to represent the machine. We have an F minor arpeggio on bass, cellos, violas, tremolos, and surprisingly bass flute, which I never really use. Violins are playing the melody, harmonized by woods at the end. And then the example develops into some wider kind of voicings on low strings with French horns on the top. And finally, this is a very tiny detail. We have a sub bass thickening up the overall sound. Cool, let's do the next one. This is very, very sweet, and we start with a bell-like sound on piano, celeste, harp, and vibraphone. We have a built-in texture with this chord or trill on strings, but also woodwind arpeggios. And leading the very slow build, we have French horns, but also on the very last bar, percussion and low brass. So for the following part, it will be pretty hard for me to show you what I'm doing in the details because there is so much going on. And I suggest if you really want to get the details to go back at the score reduction and have a look at that. Anyway, the key to this sound is basically picking the right voicings, of course, but most importantly, you want to be able to make each individual voice stand on its own without the others. It's really quite complicated and it takes a long time to get it right. That said, let's take a listen to the strings in isolation. So we have the melody on violin 1 and the other voices are either accompanying, doubling the melody, or filling in the gaps with counter phrases. And the very same kind of concept is applied to the other sections. Let's have a listen to brass. Talking about the woodwinds, we essentially have oboes doubling the main melody, so doubling violin 1. We have clarinets doubling violas and bassoons doubling cellos. And also we have flutes sometimes doubling the main melody and answering the main melody as well. And percussion is doing all the heavy lifting, so we have cymbal swells and timpani rolls for crescendos. So let's take a listen from the top. Okay, next. Apologies for the different camera angle. For some reason, I forgot to talk about this example. So for this one, we got the melody on trumpets, harmonized in triads on the last 4 notes. We got some big stabs on low strings, brass and percussion, and while looking at the score for doing this, I've learned some really cool, efficient voicings. It's a big B-flat major chord, but it's voiced in such a way that all the instruments are making space for each other. We got cellos and basses into octaves on B-flat, and we have trombones and bassoons filling out the rest of the chord, but they never really overlap or double each other, and this helps to keep the colors pure even with this dense kind of writing. We also have some stacked triads on French horns and the rest of the woodwinds. We also have runs on violins and violas 2 octaves apart. And this is also quite interesting because, as we saw before, John Williams tends to use woodwind runs, but Goldsmith here is using strings. At the very end, we have violins and French horns playing a descending phrase that terminates on a big tutti chord. And additionally, we got the usual accents on harp and percussion. Again, this is a very slowed down version of the melody, and I was quite obviously trying to replicate Time by Hans Zimmer. And in order to do that, I had to take out some of the notes to have each one be essentially 1 bar long. The example is rising intensity, moving between 2 different sections, and we start with piano first, with the top line doubled on cellos an octave lower, but we also have contrabasses, sub-bass, and a synth pad. We have some very low chords on French horns. And driving the build up to the next section, we have percussion and low brass playing some short notes. In the following part, we have a huge string section with the melody in 3 octaves, but also some answer phrases on cellos and second violin. And those answer phrases are mirrored by French horns and trombones as well, filling out the harmony too. No woodwinds for this one. I believe Hans at the time had a self-imposed rule of not using woodwinds at all. What we get instead is more brass and percussion. It's really quite crazy. On top of this, we have some electric guitars as well. I know there's quite a lot going on already, but they really do open up the sound a little bit. And finally, we end with piano, a reverse piano, and some string harmonics. But let's play everything together first, as you will hear it at the end. Okay, I think this is really quite simple compared to the previous examples, and it basically consists in a couple of things. We have this percussion groove in 7/8 over an ostinato played on piano with some stabs and accents on low strings and brass. And for the percussion groove, we have anvil, toms, bass drum, shaker, and tambourine. The melody is now taken by trumpets, French horns, and tuba. I believe Alan Silvestri is one of the only people in Hollywood using tuba for melody. And this part is not in the original Alan Silvestri's version, but I left it in because I liked it. And what I'm doing here is essentially accenting the main melody with glockenspiel, but also outlining the harmony with harp and celeste. Last one, number 60. We have some very cool recorders, and I believe the original version in the Mandalorian theme is played on bass recorder, which I don't have, but I have a tenor recorder, so I've used that. And this is quite heavily processed, and you see on the screen what kind of effects I use to get this sound. In the gaps, we have some pitch bends on electric guitars and a synth. And we have some stabs on piano, electric guitars, basses, cellos, and crotales. We have a flow tom groove in the introduction, and later orchestral toms as well, together with bass drum and sub bass. The melody is now taken by French horns, doubled by violas, but also trombones, electric guitars, and piano. We have acoustic guitars on the accompaniment, together with cellos and basses. And the last line is harmonized with trumpets, violins, and trombones. Finally, it ends with some recorders again. Cool, that was fun. Very hard to do, not gonna lie, but fun. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And if you did, you might want to check out the previous episodes too. They're gonna pop out at the end. Please do leave a comment, like, and subscribe, as I'm planning lots and lots of similar content for the future. And of course, if you enjoy free education like this, please consider becoming a patron. That being said, thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye.